the Nazi hated both the Jew and the Slav. They hated the Jew because in their minds, the Jew was synonymous with the Bolshevik. The Jew was a Bolshevik, or the Jew was an evil, greedy capitalist. But when you look at Nazi rhetoric, and if you look at how the Nazis talked and what they had to say, for the most part, when it came to tying the Jews in with a particular enemy, it was the Jews are Bolsheviks. And the Nazis exploited certain facts to justify what they wanted to do. They did. They pointed to certain grievances and realities, and I'm not saying this to justify what the Nazis said or believed in or did. I'm simply telling you how they pushed their propaganda, how they advanced their ideology. They would exploit certain facts. And the fact was that there were Jews who were in the ranks of the Bolsheviks. There were a lot of Jewish people in the ranks of the Bolsheviks. You had, for example, after World War I, Germany was like the Wild West. There was a lot of crime. There was a lot of, probably worse than the Wild West, actually. There was a lot of degeneracy, and it was a very, very just sleazy society with a lot of moral depravity. Depravity was very common in post-World War I Germany. And there was also a lot of socialism being pushed and Marxism that was being pushed. And there was a whole hodgepodge of Marxist rebels and just terrorists. And the Marxists in Germany had this vision that Germany would become a satellite state for the Soviet Union. So, for example, you had the Spartacist uprising, which was a socialist/leftist uprising, and they wanted Germany to become this Marxist state. And look at some of the people behind the Spartacist uprising. You will see Rosa Luxemburg. There was another uprising in Germany. It was in Bavaria, I believe, and it was led by a guy by the name of Eugene Levine. He wasn't the only guy involved, but he was one of the main figures involved in this Marxist uprising in Bavaria. And Eugene Levine, if you ever see this guy's face, this guy looked like an Arab. He looked like that Arab guy, that, what was his name? Ibn Khattab guy who was leading the Chechens against the Russians in the 90s. He looks like an Arab, which really goes to show that the Jews really are a Semitic people. People say that, oh, most of these Jews are Khazarians. A lot of Jews look Semitic. They have Semitic features. But yeah, Eugene Levine looks like an Arab. That's a side issue, not the main point. But it's a very interesting observation nonetheless, at least for me. Eugene Levine was a socialist Marxist rebel in Germany, and he wanted Germany to be under the Soviet Union. And when he was running his very, very short-lived Marxist government in Bavaria, there was a shortage in, I want to say, baby formula. And he wrote in a correspondence, I believe, with Lenin, saying that it doesn't matter if babies in Bavaria die from malnourishment, because those babies are just the children. They're the spawn of the evil bourgeoisie or whatever. And these people were just evil. So you had this Bolshevik threat in Germany, and it was real. And millions of people were slaughtered by the Bolsheviks within the Soviet Union. So put yourself in the shoes of a German living right after World War I. You're living in poverty. Your country has been devastated. Your country is now in debt slavery to those who defeated you. And now, albeit the Germans did start the aggression in World War I, and they did lose, but put yourself, I'm not trying to justify the mentality, I'm just saying put yourself in the shoes of someone who lived there, and you can, in a way, understand why there was so much anger. Why there was so much anger. Your country was completely up to its shoulders in debt. It was a slave to debt. Now, the Germans lost. They lost, yes. They got their asses kicked. They started the war. They started the aggression against France. This is all the reality of World War I. I don't really feel sorry for Germany because it lost in World War I and had to pay the price. But that's not how people in Germany saw it. They saw it as they were being exploited, and they saw how there were people who were trying to exploit the grievances in World War I for the grievances that happened after World War I for the advancement of Marxism. And they were trying to use the terribly diminished state of German society to their advantage so that they can do a revolution. And there were revolutions, and they were Bolshevik revolutions, and they were attempts to make Germany a satellite state for the Soviet Union. And if you look at the Spartacist uprising or the uprising that happened in Bavaria, these people were connected, these movements were connected to Soviet communism. So in comes Adolf Hitler to save the day. Here comes Adolf Hitler to save the German race from the evil Bolsheviks. And the Germans are looking at someone like Eugene Levine, or they're looking at someone like Rosa Luxemburg, and they're thinking, oh my goodness, these Jews are going to bring us to our demise. We have to stop them. Or else they are going to devastate Germany with Marxism and also with moral depravity and degeneracy. And the Nazis were a party that presented themselves as one of family values and of order and of making a good society, of making a good, healthy society. Now, albeit the Nazis used moral values as a mask to hide their evil motivations, but they presented themselves as a party of order and of cleanliness and of fighting the evil Bolshevik. Now, when you look at the rise of Nazism in this context, you can understand how Nazism got so popular. You can understand it. Because we see the same sort of actions, the same sort of rhetoric being done today to justify far-right politics. We see this taking place in Europe. You have the AfD party in Germany saying you have migrants in Germany who are causing lots of crime. Migrants in Germany who are raping and stealing and stabbing, and you have terrorism in Europe. Vote for the AfD and we will get rid of all these problems. So you look at the problems that have come about from the influx of migrants, from this flood of migration into Europe, and you see all of the problems that have come with that, albeit at certain times it has been exaggerated, but there are problems, don't get me wrong. And the AfD comes along and says, we're going to save the day. And that's what the Nazis did. They said all of these Bolsheviks who are causing problems in Germany, and they did cause a lot of problems in Germany. I mean, the terrorism that was done by Marxists, by Bolsheviks, was horrendous. They were shooting police officers. They were doing ambushes on cops. They were killing people. They were doing revolutions within Germany. It was actually, if you think about it, oh man, I'm probably going to get heat for this, but what the Bolsheviks were doing in Germany after World War I was probably worse than what certain migrants have done in Germany. To a certain extent, in the sense that you don't have migrants actually doing revolutions within Germany and then setting up Sharia courts, right? In that sense, the Bolsheviks were a much more organized threat than some individual migrants are in Germany. The Bolsheviks and the Marxists in Germany were actually doing revolutions. And I think there was an uprising in Hamburg, there was the Spartacist uprising, and there was also the uprising in Bavaria with Eugene Levine. And if you look at the ranks, and I know it's kind of hard to find this information unless you go to Yandex, which is the Russian Google. It's much easier to find information on this topic. But if you look at the people in the ranks of the Bolshevists, revolutionaries in Germany after World War I, you will see a lot of Jewish names. I'm not saying this to justify what the Nazis believed in or did, but it's a fact. And the Nazis exploited this reality. They exploited this reality. And they saw, think about it, here you are in post-World War I Germany, and you're seeing the Soviet Union, and you're hearing the news about all of the horrors happening in the Soviet Union, and how people are being butchered by the Bolsheviks in Russia. And you see that there are a lot of Jewish people in the ranks of the Bolshevik government in Russia. And then you're seeing revolutions happening in your own country, and some of these revolts briefly succeed. For example, the Bavarian uprising had a brief moment of success. It failed, but it had a brief moment of success. And who saved Bavaria? Who saved Bavaria from people like Eugene Levine and from these Bolsheviks? You had the Freikorps. These were German nationalists who were battle-hardened by World War I. They went into Bavaria, and they raised hell, and they killed a whole bunch of people. They even went into these people were evil. The Freikorps were evil, but they crushed the Bolsheviks in Bavaria. It's a fact, and a lot of these Freikorps guys would end up being a part of the Nazi party. So here you see, oh my God, Bolsheviks, they're taking over Bavaria. And then in comes the right wing, the nationalists, to save the day. So what's going on the heads of the Germans? The right wing, the nationalists are the hero. Not some Christian Democrat, or not some some German Democrat. No. It's the Nazis. They're the good guys. They're actually doing something. Now, albeit when the Freikorps guys went into Bavaria, they went into a Catholic seminary and they executed a whole bunch of Catholics, and they accused them of being Bolsheviks, which really went to show that these guys were evil. They had other motivations other than just fighting Bolshevism. But in the minds of the German masses, the nationalist right-wingers were the solution to the problem. So the Germans exploited this. Now, who else was involved in communism? It wasn't just Jews. You had Russians, non-Jewish Russians, who were communists, who were atheists, who were Bolshevik, and they were fighting the Nazis in World War II when the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union. And when the Nazis were occupying various parts of the Soviet Union, you had partisans. The Germans had to deal with a very menacing force known as the partisans. Partisans were just simply pro-Soviet militias who were fighting for the liberation of the occupied areas of the Soviet Union against the Nazis. So they were fighting against the Nazi occupation of various areas of the Soviet Union. And anywhere you had the Wehrmacht or the SS, you had partisans who were there to fight them. Now, the partisans were not as organized or well-equipped as the Red Army was. But nonetheless, they were extremely, extremely helpful to the Red Army. Why were they so helpful? Because they were very, very efficient at draining the Wehrmacht, draining the German armed forces. They were very good at it. They were very good at draining them. Why? Because the partisans were very organized, very sneaky, and they were very subtle. And they also had a lot of forest land, a lot of very thick forest land to hide in and to organize their operations. So they were very difficult to find, very good at hiding. And they would put explosives on train tracks, and they would blow up trains. The trains were for the German armed forces to transport goods to the German soldiers. Very, very vital supplies, without which you couldn't really have a successful military operation within the Soviet Union. Logistics is everything in war. If you do not have the logistical advantage, you will lose. This is the art of war. If you do not win in the logistics department, doesn't matter how well trained your soldiers are, doesn't matter how well armed they are, if you lose in logistics, you lose the war. If you are cut off from food, you starve. You can't have an army without food. If you cut them off from water, you lose, right? You win. If you cut your enemy off from water, you win. They can't drink, they can't fight, they can't live without water. You cut them off from vital munitions, ammunition, weapons, etc., you win. An army cannot survive without a flow of supplies. So the partisans were very good at cutting off the Germans from their much-needed supplies. They would cut off supply lines. They would put bombs on railways to blow up trains. And then when the train got blown up, they'd go to the site of the explosion, and they would kill all the survivors. That's how they did things. And so they would cut the German army off from much-needed supplies. They would also ambush German soldiers, forcing the German soldiers, or the German government, to divert a lot of its forces to fight the partisans. So soldiers who would otherwise be fighting the Red Army were now having to deal with the partisans in the wilderness. So the partisans were draining the Germans of manpower and supplies. And the Germans now had to dealing with partisans, which meant that the SS had to go out and hunt down partisans. And this is where the SS Delavanger came in. The Delavanger were a very, very brutal SS unit consisting of literally people from crazy houses. They would go into crazy houses in Germany and they would say, okay, listen, you want to go out and kill and rape? Here's a gun, here's a uniform, go out and have fun. And the SS Delavanger would go and do horrendous atrocities in the Soviet Union. Mass rape, slaughter, horrendous atrocities. And if a village was hiding partisans, or just one partisan, or if a village was even suspected of hiding partisans, that village was to be massacred. There was no mercy. And many times, the Nazis would simply use the partisan threat to the German military as an excuse to do atrocities. So they would say, okay, well, we found some Russians, and they're not really Bolsheviks, but we're going to kill them anyway. So the Bolshevik threat was used as a justification to slaughter Jews and Slavs, Jews and Russians, Jews and Belarusians, Jews and Soviets. And there were cases of Nazis actually going into villages and burying people alive. It wasn't just killing with guns. It wasn't just killing with bullets. They would actually bury people alive. And you could say, well, this is just the cruelty that takes place in war. Soldiers get frustrated. Soldiers get angry. Soldiers get enraged. And they kill. And, things like this happen in Vietnam. And people will point to Vietnam and say, yeah, things like this happen in war. It's not necessarily the policy of the government. But in the case of Nazi Germany, it was the policy. This was the policy. And the Nazi rhetoric, or the Nazi narrative, was that where there are partisans, there are Jews. This is how they thought. So if they had a battle with the partisans, their policy was find the Jews nearby. Because the Jews, according to the Nazis, were supporting the partisans. So we got into a battle with some partisans, let's go find the Jews now. And that's how they operated. They went out, found Jews, and slaughtered them. And they wouldn't kill a few dozen here and there. I mean, they would kill thousands at a time. So, for example, in one case, they went out, found 4,000 Jews, killed them. 2,000, killed them. 1,000 Jews, killed them. It was on October the 7th every day. People talk about October the 7th. It was in the Soviet Union, under the Nazi reign of terror, it was in October the 7th every single day. This is how the Nazis operated. And the Nazis saw their anti-Jewish race war as a part of their anti-Slavic race war. It was all a race war, you see. The Germans had this idea of them being in a race war. They didn't see World War II as just a conflict between militaries. They saw World War II as a conflict for racial survival and also extermination. Exterminate this race so our race can survive. And they believed that if they did not wipe out the Jews, the Jews were going to destroy the German race with Marxism and with moral depravity and degeneracy. There is a quote from Hermann Göring which really illustrates this. So here's the quote. Göring said, "This war is not the Second World War. This war is not the Second World War. This is the great racial war. In the final analysis, it is about whether the German and Aryan prevails here or whether the Jew rules the world, and that is what we are fighting for out there." This is what Göring said. So they saw it as a race war. So they said you have the Übermensch. The German is the Übermensch. The German is the Superman that Nietzsche talked about. This is why the Germans were so obsessed with Nietzsche. And Nietzsche's sister was a Nazi, and she believed that her brother's philosophy was a foundation for Nazi thought, and I agree with Nietzsche's sister. I think I'm going to sit down and just read Nietzsche, because, man, every time, and I've been hearing this for a long time now, every time someone starts talking about Nietzsche and how Nietzsche's philosophy was connected to Nazism, you always have these types of people who come out and say, actually, Nietzsche's philosophy was misused or misinterpreted by the Nazis. And this is what Jordan Peterson believes in, and a whole bunch of other people believe in this stuff. I am going to sit down and just read Nietzsche. I think when I'm done reading this book on the Third Reich by Michael Berlet, I think I'm going to sit down and just read Nietzsche. It's going to be a very, very depressing and grueling endeavor, but I'm actually going to put myself through this pain and read Nietzsche so I can one day just sit in front of this camera and tell these people who are Nietzschean to just shut the hell up and stop lying. Because Nietzsche's philosophy was evil. It was demonic. And it was supremacist. It was a sick philosophy, the Nietzschean philosophy. And people will say, well, Nietzsche was misinterpreted. People say the same thing about Martin Heidegger. They say, well, Martin Heidegger actually, his philosophy is great. Yes, it was used by the Nazis, and yeah, Heidegger was a Nazi himself, but Heidegger's philosophy actually wasn't bad. It was actually really, really great, and Heidegger was a Nazi. And there's a reason why Nietzsche's sister was a Nazi. Nietzsche's sister was a devout follower of her brother's teachings, and here she is supporting the Third Reich. I don't think that's a coincidence. But the Germans said, we are the Übermensch that Nietzsche spoke of, right? We're the Übermensch, but then you have the Untermenschen. The Untermenschen are subhuman people. So the Jew is the Untermenschen. The Slav is the Untermenschen. The person with defects and deformities and the person who's infirm is the Untermenschen. This is all the Untermenschen. So it's a war between the Übermensch and the Untermenschen. It was a genetic war. They saw it as a genetic conflict. And the Slavic genes were inferior. The German genes were superior. And in order to cleanse the human race, we need to get rid of the inferior genes. So kill the handicapped, the deformed, kill people with Down syndrome, kill people who are Jewish, who are Slavic, who are Gypsy. And when the Germans were coming up with their plan to exterminate other people, they didn't just come up with a plan to exterminate the Jews. They came up with a plan to exterminate the Slavs. Now, with the Slav, and I have to say this because we have to be accurate. We can't just say things willy-nilly here. The Germans, and I want to make this distinction, and this is why people focus a lot on the Holocaust of the Jews more when it comes to the Third Reich. I mean, at least this is in part as to why people focus on it more. When it comes to Nazi extermination policy, they wanted to kill all of the Jews. That was their goal. It was to slaughter every single Jew. That was their goal, kill all the Jews. With the Slavs, they wanted to exterminate, let's say, most of the Slavs, or at least half of the Slavs, and enslave the rest. So they still saw the Slav as the Untermenschen, But they believed that the Slavs still had some use for the German race, in the sense that they wanted to enslave the Slavs who would survive the genocide of the Slavic people. Now, they still wanted to genocide the Slavs, but they wanted to keep a remainder, right? They wanted to keep a remnant of the Slavs for slaves. Now, that doesn't mean that the Germans that doesn't mean that the Germans were nicer with the Slavs, but it just means that they wanted to keep a certain number of Slavs alive to be slaves. Now, why did they want slaves? It wasn't because they saw Slavs as nicer, or they saw Slavs. It wasn't because they were nicer with the Slavs. It was because they had this vision of Germanizing Eastern Europe. They believed that Eastern Europe was originally inhabited by Germans thousands of years ago, back in Neanderthal caveman times or whatever. And so therefore Eastern Europe was a territory that rightfully belonged to the German race. And so they wanted to slaughter a huge number of Slavs. We're talking tens of millions of people they wanted to slaughter. And they did slaughter tens of millions of Slavs. And then they wanted to bring in German settlers to resettle the land. So they wanted to slaughter a huge number of the Slavs to make room for German settlers. And this was a part of a policy of Germanization, the Germanization of Eastern Europe. With the Jew, they saw no purpose for the Jew. They said the Jew just deserves to be destroyed. With the Slav, they saw the Slav as deserving of destruction and enslavement. And that's the distinction. That's the distinction. I just want to get that out there to just be, for the sake of being accurate. But it was still very, very evil. And the Germans came up with a plan to genocide the Slavs. They came up with this plan, and Himmler turned to this guy by the name of Konrad Mayer. Now, it's very, I don't know if I want to call it bizarre or interesting or whatever. I just want to point out that the last name Mayer is a common last name amongst Jews. And sometimes you see these Jewish last names for Nazi leaders. I mean, I'm just putting it out there. I mean, the ideological head of the Nazi party, his last name was Rosenberg, Alfred Rosenberg. I mean, Rosenberg, very Jewish last name. And Konrad Mayer was commissioned by Himmler to come up with a plan to exterminate the Slavs, in the Soviet Union, so that they could make room for German settlers. And Konrad Mayer came up with this plan called General Plan Ost, which means the master plan for the East. And in a prior video, I said it was the general plan. I mistranslated. No, it's actually the master plan for the East. And one of the methods of extermination that Konrad Mayer prescribed was starvation. And that's what the Germans did to the Soviets. They starved a lot of Soviets. A big example of this was the siege of Leningrad, in which the Germans cut the city off from food and then continuously bombed the city for 900 days. 1.5 million Russians were killed as a result of the siege of Leningrad. 600,000 of those 1.5 million Russians died from starvation. Now, you could say, well, this is all collateral, right? And I hate that word because it just dehumanizes people. When people say, oh, it's just collateral damage, it's very dehumanizing. But people could argue and say, well, that's just the tragedy of war, and those people were killed because of the tragedy of war that happens in every war. But if you make that argument, you will be wrong, because this was a part of policy. Every Russian who died from starvation, every Russian who was killed by an aerial bomb was killed because of the policy of the Germans. It was seen as a part of the official policy. So every time a Russian starved, every time a Russian was killed by an aerial bomb, was seen as an accomplishment of German Nazi policy. Because starvation and bombing, these were seen as methods, these were seen as just means to killing Slavs. So killing Slavs was an accomplishment, be it a Soviet soldier who was killed in the battlefield, or be it civilians who were killed in a massacre, or be it civilians who were starved to death, or be it civilians who were killed in aerial bombs. All of these deaths were seen as an accomplishment for German policy. And that's a fact. And I can show you this. I'm sorry, I got a scratchy throat today. Here is a quote from an SS leader by the name of Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski. Now, I just want to point this out. Zelewski, just like Rosenberg, is a very Jewish last name. Bach-Zelewski sounds very Slavic. Now, Bach is a German name, like Bach, the composer. But Zelewski, that's a Slavic name. That sounds like Zelensky. And I've noticed this reading about German Nazi history. You will see Nazis with Slavic last names, which is ironic because they saw the Slavs as Untermenschen, as subhuman, and they saw the Germans as superior, but yet you have Germans with Slavic last names, which really goes to show that at one point in time there was intermixture between Slavs and Germans. Hell, Prussia borders with Poland. So obviously, yes, there's going to be intermixture between Slavs and Germans, just like there's intermixture between Germans and Hispanics in the southern part of Texas. It's inevitable. It's going to happen. And I'm guessing because the Germans were very good at being flexible when it came to their ideology and making exceptions, but the Germans would have argued and said that the German genes compensates for the inferior Slavic genes. The Germans were very willing to be flexible with their ideology. Just to give you guys an example, they saw the Japanese as inferior to the Germans, but they didn't mind making an alliance with them. They saw Arabs as inferior to Germans, but they made an alliance with Arabs who were willing to work with the Nazis. Hell, here's a fact that no one really talks about. There were thousands of Arab Germans living in Germany, and thousands of them were actually sterilized. Yes, there was a small population of German Arabs in Germany, and under Nazi policy, they were sterilized. There was an anti-Arab policy in Nazi Germany. No one ever really talks about this, unless you really look at the history books. But it's a fact. Just wanted to point that out. But going back to this guy, Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski, this is what Zelewski said in the Nuremberg trials, speaking of Nazi policy, racial policy. He says, moreover, the fight against partisans was gradually used as an excuse to carry out other measures, such as the extermination of Jews and Gypsies, the systematic reduction of the Slavic peoples by some 30 million souls, in order to secure the supremacy of the German people. So he says the extermination of the Jews and the Gypsies was a part of policy, obviously. But so was the killing of the Slavs. So when they killed Slavs, by bombing, by starvation, by massacres, that was all part of policy. It wasn't just an aerial bombing that unintentionally killed civilians. It wasn't at all. I said it wasn't just. It wasn't at all that aerial bombings, that civilians being killed by aerial bombings was unintentional. They were intentional. That's my point. It wasn't that Russians starved to death because they cut off the city in order to defeat the Russians, but they didn't really want so many Russians to starve to death. No. Those Russians who starved to death, they starved because that was the policy of the Germans. It was to starve them. That was the intention. That starvation was the intention. That was policy. That was policy. So the German racial policy was not just against Jews, it was against Slavs. And they saw the two as being tied together. The Jew was the Bolshevik, but so was the Russian who was fighting against the Nazi. He was also a Bolshevik. And they used anti-communism as an excuse for racial hatred and violence. So yes, there was the threat of communism. So Russians are communists, so therefore we kill the Russian. A lot of Jews support communism, therefore we annihilate the Jews. And that's how they thought. That was their ideology. Now, what do we see happening today? And it's very, very interesting. It's very interesting. When the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, they were also Finns who were involved. They were Finns who were allies with the Germans. And that makes you wonder about Finland joining NATO. And it comes together. This is the reason why the Russians are so concerned about Finland being a part of NATO, about all these countries being a part of NATO and arming themselves against Russia. And this is all happening. You see Germans being deployed into Lithuania right now. You see the fact that Finland is now a part of NATO, which means that Finland is right next to the Russian Navy at the Kola Peninsula. And then you see, wow, the Finns and the Germans were working together in their war against the Soviet Union in World War II. There's a history here. There's a history here. And the fact that something like this happened in the past, you had Germans in World War II making an alliance with Romanians and Finns, and they were making alliances with Baltic peoples, Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians. And then you see what's happening today with the Germans working with the Lithuanians, working with the Dutch, working with all these different European peoples against the Russians. And you can see why the Russians are so concerned. And you can also see history, the light of history being reflected on the present day. And history doesn't exactly repeat, but it sure as hell rhymes. It sure as hell rhymes. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.